Hello and welcome to Trust Fundraising Q&A Live. My name is Deanna Wolf and I am the Senior Consultant for Trust Fundraising here at Tree Fundraising. And today we are supposed to be speaking with Jeff Breen, who is the CEO and co-founder of Cornerstone Fundraising and Development. And he's also working on a new fundraising prospect research database called Fundify. Unfortunately, he seems to have encountered some difficulties, so we're going to have to go ahead without him at this point. I want to talk. This is our normal scheduled session for the third Thursday of every month, and we do it live. We do it live on our Trust Fundraising Hub on Facebook, but also we have the Trust Fundraising Hub on Twitter, which is at Trust Fundraise, and we also broadcast it live on Money Tree Fundraising's LinkedIn page. So please do keep in touch, and if you have any questions, do please put them down below and put them down below. In the bottom of the recording, and I will answer as I can. So one of the things I want to let you know, prospect research, it's on me today. So it's on me. So I want to let you know why I've got the wherewithal to be answering all these questions and doing research. A lot of people do have it. Oh, there he is. He's arrived.
I'm really sorry. I was having a nightmare with the hotel Wi-Fi here, so sorry about that.
No worries. Just so you know, you might want to turn your volume up a wee bit.
Sure.
I think we're good, and we are live. So, because of everything, Jeff's at a conference at the moment, so there's some the Wi-Fi issues, and generally just conferences. One of the things I want to say is if you can introduce yourself. I've just introduced you as being the CEO and the co-founder of Cornerstone Fundraising and Development, and then the new fundraising database platform, which is Fundify. But how do you know about research?
Okay, sure. Well, I've been fundraising, working in the charity sector for 20 odd years now, and fundraising predominantly from charitable trusts and foundations in that time. I have other experience around corporate wage donors, events and stuff as well. But the bulk of my work's always been around trusts and foundations. So a good long while, 18 years really, trusts and foundations work. And then in the last 10 years, set up Cornerstone Fundraising, which has worked with a collection of associates, and collectively we've raised about 40 million for a portfolio of charities in that time.
Oh, wow. That's a lot. So you've got just a little bit of prospect research. If you've been doing trusts and foundations, you will have had to do some. Even if you get a list from someone else, you still have to, in order to understand the organization well enough to write a really good tailored application, you've got to do some of that research yourself. For myself, I'm a former public reference librarian, as I'm sure some people will know. I kind of plaster it everywhere because I liked being a librarian. It was lots of fun. And then there were some issues that got in the way due to immigration and things like that. And the fact that I left the United States after 9/11 and became a trust fundraiser instead. But from myself, I've been a trust fundraiser now for 20 years. In fact, in October, it was 20 years. And a good proportion of what I've done over that time was my own research, because I didn't have a prospect researcher to do this stuff for me. So I had to do it myself. In one instance, when I worked with the university, I had a prospect researcher, and I briefed her really, really well on what I was looking for and why I wanted it and all the background information. And she got me amazing information and really colorful stuff that had nothing to do with the application, had nothing to do with who I was or what I was going to be applying for, had everything to do with the organization. The result was that I got £750,000 from that funder, that trust fundraiser, or that trust funder. And the result from that, and what that taught me, is that if you do that little bit extra, you get a lot more out of it. And it helped a lot in the way that I was asking questions of the team that I was working with to get it. So Today, we're talking a lot about prospect research, and we will be across, not just about trust fundraising, because that's it. But one of the things that you and I had talked about yesterday was that for seasoned trust fundraisers and those just starting out, we get dumped in the deep end, especially when we're seeking funding for things and services that that trusts don't like funding, or it's last minute stuff. To stave off the absolute worst case scenario, which I think is unfortunately happening a lot more often lately. And I think given the state of the world today and the kinds of questions we're seeing pop up on social media all the time, we were talking about this. You're seeing them as well, on different streams. I tend to see them on Facebook. That's where I tend to live, and I think you were saying LinkedIn, and I know that things pop up on Twitter as well. A lot of us are dealing with these same kind of challenges. So from that point of view, I have a bunch of questions I'd like to ask you, and then we can discuss things as they go. We got a couple of questions from the audience as well. The first thing I want to know is, from your experience, what are some of the main skills you think people should cultivate when they're doing prospect research on trusts and foundations and similar funders, like lotteries and stuff like that?
Sure. So I think this type of work appeals to people that are naturally curious. So, that's like a really good, talent to develop, I guess, being interested in the work, being interested, in what the trusts do, how they were formed, the history of the trust, things like that. And who are the people that are working at these trusts, either in a voluntary capacity as a trustee or in an administration capacity, something like that. So being naturally curious, I think, opens up lots of opportunities for discovery, and as part of that, I guess, then taking the initiative to try and form a relationship or have a conversation to tease out those threads and find out a bit more information that could be ultimately useful for your application, or in terms of making your application a relatable proposal for the trustees.
Okay, and I know, and I'm going to play the stereotypes here. A lot of trust fundraisers hate picking up the phone, and they hate doing that. So, is it worth? I'm one of those. As much as I'm an outgoing person to a certain extent, I'm also very introverted, and picking up telephone is absolutely terrifying to me. So I script it. I write down questions. I know that for this session, as much as I could probably talk for days and hours about trust fundraising generally and the state of the world generally, I also have to write things down to make sure that I don't miss things out. Would you think that that's a good way to go about it?
Definitely. For me, the whole, trying to ad lib it, I think, fills me with fear as well. So I think, having a brief, knowing what you want to talk about is quite a reassuring proposition. So for me, I'd make sure I've got the, for want of a better word, the elevator pitch about the project nailed. So I know, I can open confidently say, here's the project I'd like to talk about, and very quickly you can establish whether that's something that's going to be of interest or not. And that also limits your exposure in terms of, you're not on the back foot being, interrogated on the phone about questions you're not prepared for.
And what do you say when people say, but they've not given me a phone number, they've not given me this?
I think that's part.
Or they've said, don't call.
Prospect research journey, is it not? Is like discovering that. I think unsolicited applications, where it says no unsolicited applications, fair enough. If you put in a cold application, don't expect to get anywhere. If you develop a relationship with them and try to discover why there's no unsolicited applications, you might actually be invited to put in an application.
I know that I've done that in the past. I think having a North American voice sometimes can make things, I can be a little bit bullshier in the way I approach things. But I've called up and said, it says no unsolicited, so how do I get solicited? And then I giggle because, they'll find it, hopefully they'll find it funny and not too inappropriately cheeky. But I think sometimes it is that having that information there so you can say, right, I realize that you don't want them, but is there any chance at all? And sometimes removing options is actually a really strong way to go about doing things.
Yeah. And as well, I mean, if they say, the trustees like to discover their own projects, then you've got to find out more about the trustees and what their interests are and what industries they're in, where they spend their time. If if this trust is really on your list of, it has to happen, but otherwise just take it off the list and look somewhere else. One of the things we talked about yesterday is, shortening your list so you've got the best possible approaches, and part of that's exclusion as well, isn't it?
It most definitely. I find that my long lists are often 5 or 6 times the length of my short lists. And if I get a long list of 400 or 500 trusts for a given project, I'm actually not unhappy with it. It takes a little bit more time to go through, but my short list, when I get it, even if it's only 30 or 40 trusts, and some of them are slightly on the edge of iffy, I just want to test the water with them. I know that I've got a much stronger chance of getting funding for those, and so my work efforts are focused to where the best chances are versus, wherever absolutely everyone's been going. I know that one of the things I've been saying, people have been asking, well, especially with the cost of living crisis, who do you go to? Who do you go to? And here's a list of 10 funders you can go to. I see lists of these are the places you can go all the time. And I think, yes, and now that you've said these are the places you can go, you're now in competition with way more people than you ever were before with those.
Yeah, I think there's always a risk, with any lists that are published, generally outwardly, because everyone picks up the same circulars. So you automatically, there's a multiplier there that rather than, if you'd found this trust, by yourself, or you already have an existing relationship with them, it's much better if it's someone you already know. Then, most trusts have that discretionary clause, don't they? The trustees at their absolute discretion can decide what they want to do. Well, if you already know the trust and you say, hey, we're having a real problem here with some cost of living crisis type stuff, then actually they might just decide to fund that, and they have the power to be able to do that, and you've already got a relationship with them. That's brilliant. So why would you then ditch all that and go running towards a list that 500 other people are going to be making exactly the same application as you? So I always try and weigh that up and work with the people you know and have a relationship with first.
And that takes me to my next question. When you don't have the relationship and you are relying on databases and cold research and desktop research, you're in the process of building a fundraising database. And I know that you've asked a lot of members and you've put it out to the Trust Fundraising Hub membership for feedback and to try it and to beta test. I know that I've helped you out with some of the beta testing. I'm really good at poking holes in things and which is a really great talent when you're a trust fundraiser, and really horrible when you're dealing with everybody else.
When you're building something, yeah.
Exactly. So, but there are a lot of research databases out there. Some of them are great, some of them are not so great, some of them are not so good at all. What are the elements you think are most important when you're choosing a database? And that's whether it's free or subscription. What should you be looking for to help set you up to be able to do good research?
So I'm probably going to answer this in a slightly different way. So one of the main reasons for starting Fundify is I've used all of the databases that are out there for years and years, and a lot of them, start from an area of recycled information. So it's information that was brought in from a data house ages ago. There are probably people in the organizations working on that, but because it's human orientated research, it's really difficult to scale at volume. And so for me, it's always been about how current is the data, because if you go into Google and you put, XYZ trust, you might get a result from 2002, you might get a result from 2015, you might get a result from 2022, the latter being highly unlikely. But, trusts change in their giving structure and their criteria. They respond to things like the cost of living crisis, which changes, the amount of money they've got to give in other areas as well. So for me, it's always about accuracy, relevance, and currency of information. And that's like, if you're using lists, whether they're free or paid for at the moment, then quite often they're just a starting point for your research. It's like, okay, this is the baseline, and then you still got to go and touch 5 or 6 other pieces of information to validate that information and make sure it's right. And I guess for me, what we're trying to do with Fundify, by working with a lot of external, really talented people that can help us by picking holes in the stuff that we're doing. It helps make it better, right? And so what we want is to be able to shorten that research journey for everyone, not just people that are specialists in the field, but for people that haven't touched fundraising before, because you have like massive analysis paralysis with tens of thousands of potential funds and funders out there. And how do you narrow that down to your 20 or 30 that you actually need to get the job done? And that's the real kind of challenge. And trying to have information that's current, as there's more and more stuff being posted online every day, it just turns into this like murky soup where you can disappear down rabbit holes for like weeks or months, research that turns out to be completely inappropriate.
Yeah, no, I know the rabbit hole issue. I know that one of the things I do, like you said, is I use the databases that we have, and at Moneytree we use a few, and I've used a good number of them, some of which I really, really, really liked, and when they changed, they became not as good for me. And when you're dealing with an expense, you want it to be a worthwhile expense. So I use it as my first stop, my first port of call to get that from 10,000 down to 500.
Yeah.
And then that's a dealable with number that I can go into greater detail and figure out what I need to do with it from. But that's definitely, thank you. As I mentioned before, we're seeing a lot of questions about which funders to approach, especially when it's things for, and I think it's coming from someone in finance or someone in SMT will come and say, we need to get this. We need new windows. We need a new roof. We need new uniforms. We need new medical equipment for the individual staff members rather than, or we need new desks, or we need new computers for everybody in the operations. And it's not on the service delivery side. It's in the HQ. It's the office stuff. It's the business of the charity that needs the replacement rather than the services and cause that they're supporting side of the aspect. How do you approach research for that? Because my tendency is it's not trust fundraising. Trust fundraising shouldn't go for that.
Yeah, I think it's really difficult because when you're in a job that there's like overbearing pressure that you are the magician that can solve all these problems. And sometimes you've got to be defensible about your position as well. Whereas, if it's like kind of core cost of salaries, then that's fine. If it's like, can we have a desk or something that's for the staff, it's not necessarily beneficiary led unless it leads to an outcome for the beneficiaries. So I think being able
and a really logical, you're not reaching for like 17 steps away from it.
Yeah. So I think that's really difficult to have those conversations, particularly with people that don't understand this area of fundraising, because with the best will in the world, if you're shaking a bucket at the end of the Sainsbury's checkout, the money that's raised there is unrestricted. It could be used for anything, and that's just not how it works with trust. So you've got to spend it on what you say you're going to spend it on, otherwise they'll want their money back. And yeah, I think there's an education piece that needs to go into kind of, HR teams and other people that say, we've got this magician here, we just need to write a wish list for.
Yeah, and I think the wish lists are great. Wish lists are really important to have because it means that when you are trolling through all the funders and you see a gem that all of a sudden matches exactly what you're doing, you can perform magic sometimes. But I think it really is, unless trusts are the only income stream, in which case the unrestricted funding that's in the organization, unrestricted cash reserves need to be, and money that's being spent that's unrestricted for activities that are actually very fundable to trusts and foundations. That exchange has to happen, so that you need to have, it is an education piece, but often I find it's with finance teams who've just allocated money where they think it's the easiest to allocate. And it can be a really hard conversation because finance thinks of income generation as a sales thing. I've found in third sector, not exclusively. And there are some vast and major examples of how that's not working or how that's different in some charities. But I think that's a question where you really need to, this isn't an easy thing. Give it 10 minutes, have a quick look, see if it's there. But chances are, if you need something that is solely for the office, or to get new windows replaced or cost of living high, our electricity bills going up in the office and everyone's going now living in the office, you kind of want to say, well, can people work from home?
Mm-hmm.
Do you need the office? So I think some of those hard conversations have to happen. And the unfortunate thing is it comes on to the trust fundraiser to say no. And so we have to be really clear to say, no, there aren't any. Sorry, you have to figure out another way to do this.
And on the education piece as well, being like a wee bit solution focused. So it's like, this is like a hard no, but actually more aligned with our mission, we could do X, Y, Z for the beneficiaries. And look, there's all these funders here that would love to fund that work. So
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I've got a couple more questions that I want to make sure we get in because we've only got about 10 minutes left.
Okay.
Now, I am a bit of a research geek. I will put my hand up definitely to that. And especially if I find trivia and things that I really like. I was telling you about my going down a bunch of rabbit holes to find information. However, I found very good, useful information that I can still use 20 years later. The issue is that it took about an afternoon of me doing a search when I could have been doing other things. So how do you handle the research rabbit holes? How do you stay on track, and what are your tips for staying efficient and effective when you're doing research?
So for us, if we're working with an organization, we have what we call first pass research, which is like the long list. So that is, we look at the work of the charity and break that down into certain projects, and then try and allocate funders to each element of the work that a charity is likely to undertake. And then we do like second pass, which is more in-depth, down a rabbit hole research that can consume quite a lot of time. The main things we look for on that to speed it up are exclusion criteria. So, there's no way they're going to work with us. Reduce the list in that way. So removing people based on exclusion criteria is a really helpful thing. At the moment, there aren't any databases that do that, but there will be in the very near future. Get a quick plug in there. And then after that, we use, rather than just like a funding tracker or a grid to keep you on track, we have like a pivot table. And ours works in the fact that if you've got a funder that would do like staff salaries, but they would also do a minibus, there are probably 1,000 funders out there that will do salaries, but there's only about 6 that will do minibuses. So if you really need a minibus, you've got to prioritize your approach on the minibus first, and then come back to the salaries afterwards. And the funders that do both, you'd obviously lean towards the minibus with them.
Mm-hmm. And you were telling me yesterday that there's a correlation. You've found a correlation between the time spent doing the research and the results you get.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's completely linear. If you spend a good couple of hours researching a prospect, making connections, talking to them about your project, the chance of it being successful is exponentially higher than if you just send in a cold application where you haven't done the research properly. The bid's poorly informed or written because you haven't done enough research, and you're just kind of on a wing and a prayer. Then that's you can kind of expect a less successful result.
So what do you do then when you've got funders who give like under 5,000, and they give generally? Do you reduce the amount of funding and do the sort of, mine is my test is it worth a stamp? And I spend about 10 minutes on the small funders, because sometimes that's all the information that's out there, and going in depth isn't necessarily the most appropriate thing, because really a lot of the small funders, I wouldn't say mailing list, but they're all looking for the same kind of thing. So I tailor as much as I can.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I don't want to spend hours on somebody a chance for £1,000.
Yeah, exactly. So there are plenty of those funders about. I live in the Northeast, and the Northeast have kind of a collection of small funders that people can approach for those sort of things. But there's also the community foundations and things like that that are around about that manage a huge number of trusts, do an amazing job for grassroots charities really successfully. And sometimes it's about ordering. So if you're a small grassroots organization, actually, you're much better off going to the community foundation locally. They manage between 30 and 120 different trusts, and they can tour around inside finding the perfect match for you. And then actually, off the back of getting a little bit of funding through the door, you can then go out and target these other charities that are there, where it's, cost of a stamp or a very short application, but you're then match funding against something you've already got. So it's like, go for where your best wins and most likely wins are to be first. And then it's like, oh God, what did we say yesterday? Not low hanging fruit. That's a hideous phrase, but
quick wins.
Quick wins. Yeah, exactly. So how can you build on that with these quick wins that might have little pots of money there, but actually can add up quite quickly?
Yeah. And I think I'm based in Scotland, and so the majority of the funders give under 5,000 at a time. And you do have to do a lot more research on them, but it is a much smaller market. On the other hand, £5,000 for some charities is like £50,000 for others. And it's valuable money for them. I know that there's a lot of talk out there about funders. The application system is horrible and it's outdated, and it is in some ways, but it's still their money to give, not our money to take. It's our money to receive.
Absolutely.
And I think it is still a gift. You wouldn't go to a major donor and say, you owe us money. And I think there's an attitude that
you could
trust owe us money.
Yeah,
I think it would be. We have had a couple of questions. We've got just a couple of minutes left, but these questions I think will be answered quite easily for you. What are the steps that you take that allow you to be confident in your prospect research and that you're ready to apply to a funder?
So I think it's about identifying the project and the work first and being really, really clear on that. And once you kind of internally have the buy-in for that as well, because if we're working with the charity chief exec or trustees, we may be in a meeting with the funder, but actually the CEO is going to carry the day-to-day responsibility of making sure that project is delivered in the way that it should be for the charity. My job as a fundraiser won't have the management of that. I might do some reporting on it, but it's actually not my particular can or millstone to carry. So getting the internal buy-in for the project and everyone being aligned is, like, I think, crucial to the success, and that actually makes the application easier as well, because you're then you're not selling something that's at odds with the work of the organization or leading the funding, which is obviously a total no-no.
And there's no mission drift.
Yeah.
I know that for myself, I there's a certain point where I just draw the line. I could research a charity I could spend hours on it, but if there's a limited amount of information, I think I give them about 20 minutes and I see what I can find in 20 minutes. And if there's a lot more to find after 20 minutes, then I go. But I've got about a 20-minute. If I can't find anything after a certain point, I just write, that's as much as I've got, and I've got to write it based on what I have. But I think I've been doing this for a long time, and so I can read I read between what's there. I read what's there, and I can sometimes fill in what's not there, just because I've got a sense of what the market is like and what the funder landscape is like out there. But for the most part, it's you can go on forever, but there's a certain point where you have to say, right, I have to write an application.
Yeah, exactly.
Now I have to go. And if the project is ready and the project is complete, it makes it a lot easier to come to that stage. You're right. I think the biggest part of doing the research is making sure that you've got the project right in the first place. And
then once you have, actually, going out as well continuously is quite important. So keeping that momentum once you've started, the actual fundraising process of the applications, because you can go into analysis paralysis thinking there's always going to be a better funder, or what about this angle or something else, but actually getting on the treadmill with it as well is quite important. Particularly when I guess time and deadlines are against you.
Definitely. Now that question came from Rosie Rebecca, who's also asked us a question about successful letters to a funder, the format and the content of them. And I think, Rosie, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave that question because it's not about prospect research at this point. That's about the application itself.
Sure.
So I can answer that in next month's session. Kelly Parsnip got in touch and she said, do you have any tips on managing prospect data? Is it best to use a scoring or a likelihood system? And because it's hard sometimes to know how to prioritize trust when you're looking at a lot of data in an Excel sheet or a database that your organization works. How do you make the decisions?
Yeah, so for me, it's about again, kind of the size and scale of the project will determine that information for you. I think not keep going to external databases is handy. Like creating your own tracker or template is a useful internal tool to have. So I'd always encourage people to do that anyway. And then you're in control of the information and the flow. And like mine are always color coded like traffic lights. So you know, green is obviously successful. That's great. Red is like a no. Amber's like we're not sure, being worked on, something like that. So you know, I have color coded because I think it relays management information really clearly to the, you know, the organizations I'm working with about where the situations are. But everyone works differently. I just think having your own pipeline and your own process is really important for staying on top of things, because otherwise you're pulled in a million different directions on a daily basis, and that's really tricky.
I think for me, you have to find a system that works for you personally. If you move into a charity and they've got their own system and it works for you, that's great. If not, then you need to come up with something that works for you, because it's individual. It's what you're bringing, your own experience as a researcher, what you've done in the past to research will come into that. So I think having that decision, I know that my first list thing that I do is always deadlines. And then if it's one of the trusts that has a quarterly deadline and I've got a lot, and I look at the deadline and my plan of work fits into the research. So it's not just that one's coming up in 6 months and we've got a lot of work to do. Is there anything along the way that I can get in the place? Can I get a 2-page application ready so that I can do it? And then I can just spend half a day shipping out a bunch of little ones.
Yeah.
But I work that in, and I think keeping the deadlines in mind. I mean, the scoring and the likelihood is great, and that's there. I don't always have all the information to be able to do that. So I kind of go on what information do I have, and how can I use that to determine it?
Weighting's really difficult when the data changes. So if they've always given, you know, if you're doing it for like National Lottery Awards for all, always going to give around about 10 grand. That's really easy. If you've got a trust that has changed its priorities in the last 12 to 18 months, actually all the giving criteria has changed, and you can't apply the same weighting scale for, you know, to that you would other trusts that you're working with. So I think there is an inherent danger with weighting things. So again, mine are much simpler, same as yours, kind of deadline focused. When can we apply? What's the application window? You know, will there be a project that's a good fit within that time frame? If not, they'll, you know, be recycled to another year.
Yep. And the great thing is I tend to do with a lot of small ones, just because I've worked in organizations where small ones become very effective. But often they've got multiple deadlines in a year. So if you miss January, you can go in May, and that's not that far of a distance. And often with that that's where the quick wins come in, is that they do tend to make decisions quite quickly. We're almost at the end. You had mentioned about researching trustees, which it becomes a little bit of a GDPR nightmare, and I know it becomes an issue. It's fine when you're researching for major donors. There's clear rules around that. We've all gone through that whole privacy policy, legitimate interest, who can you contact, who can you not, when do you have to let them know? That's a constant discussion. But when it comes to trustees, how does that work?
So really anything that's public domain is fair game. So, you know, I obviously listed on the Charity Commission. So that's a starting point. You can see which other trusts or charities they're linked to, which is obviously quite helpful when you're kind of drawing your spider diagram of where, you know, the funding and relationships go. If they are doing things in the community, like their Lord Lieutenant or Deputy Lieutenant, then obviously there's normally quite a lot of information kind of surrounding that in terms of how active they are in the community, who they've worked with previously. That will give you an idea. If you're a disability charity and you find that they've been to another disability charity locally, then you might find that the trust are aware of disability issues generally, which would be great if you happen to be making an application. So it's quite, you don't have to have a direct conversation with them. It's more about what information is in the general public domain that you could use to inform your application and tailor it accordingly.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to realize that, and remember that the sources of information, if you're going through Google, remember it's basically a bulletin board, and some people pay to put their articles in front of other people's and overpin the notices. But Google's algorithms are just Google's algorithms, and they're just looking for words. They're not there's no qualification necessarily, which leads me to my very last question, and hopefully you've had a chance to think about this. What 2 pieces of advice would you give to the researchers and the people doing research out there? What 2 pieces of advice would you give?
So I think make time for the research, and this is going back to the earlier point of the more time you spend on the research, the more successful your outcome's going to be. So, there's this like awful statistic. I think it's for professional fundraisers, it's 1 in 10 are successful. For volunteers, trustees, people, roped in at the PTA and things like that, or the local faith group, it's 1 in 100. So to, improve those statistics, spend more time doing the research, use information that's available to you, from statutory and, sources like Google and stuff as well. And just try and build up a picture, a strong picture of the project, and then a good picture of who you're applying to and why you're applying to them. And always, in my experience, being, the trustees are putting this money there to help the beneficiaries. So always be beneficiary led and tailor that right the way through your applications as well, in terms of, what good is this money going to do? Because that's ultimately why they're giving it away. Mm-hmm.
Okay, mine are qualify the source that you're getting the information from and make sure that it's a good source and it's not just trolling the internet. Although trolling the internet is great, but when you're looking at when you get a post up, who's published it? What have they done? I had friends post something about gifts that we're getting for someone the other day, and it was a great idea. It was a really lovely gift. I saw the picture. I went to who the seller was, and it's we thought it was going to be an antique. It was a distribution company that was obviously from across the planet, and probably mass makes things. And instead of being an antique, it was resin copy. So you get the same thing with information. So really be clear about where you're getting it, and that you fact check it if you're fact checking through any of the systems or any of the typical systems that are out there, make sure that it's a good one that you're going to and it doesn't have its bias. There will be bias in everything. So keep an eye out for it, because you can make it work for you. You can make it, or you can let it work against you. So if you get that and you get accurate information, that means that you're coming from a good, strong position. And then the other thing is pay attention to the detail when you're doing this. So especially names, charity registration numbers, what's known and isn't known. And I think my best example of names is there is a charity in Scotland here. There's two examples I've got. One is that one of the charities was we had five different folders in our filing cabinet, because we were still just paper based at the time. And five different folders for what looked like 5 different charities. They were approached every single year, all 5 of them. It turned out that they were one charity, and we weren't getting money from them. So there's a reason why.
Yeah.
The hard thing, and this is where I found out charity registration numbers and made sure that I now put them on every document when I'm doing my research, so I add the charity number, is that even the legal team that was dealing with it had different names for it. So they never called it by the same name. They never called it by the same thing. So if you put the charity number on it, it does bring it back to the one that you're talking about. Yeah. The similar example I have with that is the Robertson Trust and Robertson Trust up here in Scotland. One gives out about 20 grand a year. One gives out about 20 or 30 million a year. And it's the matter of having the word "the"
Yeah.
involved. So make sure that those kind of details are really important. Yeah, that's really where it comes down to, is getting your research right and keeping your details. Any last thoughts?
So my only last thought, not really on prospect research side, but just I guess general tip as well, is that a lot of the bigger trusts have their own CRM systems now, so that keeps track of who's applied, when they applied, if they're successful or not. What the communication has been like. What do they get? Do they get an annual report? Was their reporting on time? Things like that. So I think it's just being really mindful that the work up to getting the grant's one thing, but being doing the correct acknowledgement and thanking people appropriately is massively important for a continuing good relationship with that trust. And as they're investing more in their tech, they're getting much better at monitoring that sort of stuff.
And so keep records in your own organization.
Yeah.
Keep the records that you wish were there when you arrived.
Yeah.
So that if trust fundraisers leave and they move on to other locations, you get consultants, and we're both working for consultancies. So if you've got that, leave the information so that the next person coming in behind you has a good chance of keeping it, because it's not about us. It's not about the charity. It's about the beneficiaries. And it's our ability to make sure that we're doing the right thing for our beneficiaries or causes, if it's not a group of individuals or animals or other things. So thank you so much. And now I understand that you've got another version, another beta version that you want to get tested.
Yes.
Of Fundify.
So yeah, I'll put that in the chat. This is a free version for individuals, so it really covers off people with welfare needs, living in poverty, disability, or want to do something with education. But there's about 7,500 opportunities in there. So this is like the start of the personalization. So it asks you a few questions, and then it tries to profile the funders based on your responses. So we're kind of dipping our toe into the area of personalization and AI, and hopefully that will get better the more people use it. So if we can get some people using it, testing it, feeding back to us, we'll then make it better.
That's great. The link will be in the bottom below the recording, in the chat that's below the recording for this session, and I will transfer that over to the Money Tree LinkedIn and the Trust Fundraising Hub on Twitter. So and if you can put down how to get back in touch with you with any feedback, that would be great.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope you've got some good tips and tricks out of this. Research is research, and everyone's going to do it slightly differently, but there's some good best practice things that we've talked about today. Just remember, our next session is going to be December 15th. So it's the third Thursday in December at 12:15 to 12:45. And that'll be on Trust Fundraising Hub here on Facebook. Also Trust Fundraise, at Trust Fundraise, which is the Trust Fundraising Hub on Twitter, and on the Money Tree LinkedIn page. If you have any questions throughout the month, keep an eye on them, keep track of them, and let us know, and we'll answer you then. Until then, thank you very much. Thank you so much, Jeff, for coming along, and I really hope you enjoy your conference.
Thanks very much. Speak soon.
Okay, cheers, bye-bye.
Bye.